Understanding gross domestic product (GDP). The calculation of a country's GDP encompasses all private and public consumption, government outlays, investments, additions to private inventories, paid-in construction costs, and the foreign balance of trade. Exports are added to the value and imports are subtracted. 6.9% US real GDP growth rate annualized during the fourth quarter of 2021, up from the 2.3% growth in the third quarter. For all of 2021, real GDP grew by 5.7% versus a 3.4% decline in 2020. Nominal GDP, called current dollar GDP by the BEA, increased 14.3% in the fourth quarter and 10% for 2021. Of all the components that make up a country's GDP, the foreign balance of trade is especially important. The GDP of a country tends to increase when the total value of goods and services that domestic producers sell to foreign countries exceeds the total value of foreign goods and services that domestic consumers buy. When the situation occurs, a country is said to have a trade surplus. If the opposite situation occurs, if the amount that domestic consumers spend on foreign products is greater than the total sum of what domestic producers are able to sell to foreign consumers, it is called a trade deficit. In this situation, the GDP of a country tends to decrease. GDP can be computed on a nominal basis or a real basis, the latter accounting for inflation. Overall, real GDP is a better method for expressing long-term national economic performance since it uses constant dollars. For example, suppose there is a country that in the year 2011 had a nominal GDP of $100 billion. By 2021, this country's nominal GDP had grown to $150 billion. Over the same period of time, prices also rose by 100%. In this example, if you were to look solely at the nominal GDP, the economy appears to be performing well. However, the real GDP, expressed in 2011 dollars, would only be $75 billion, revealing that in actuality, an overall decline in real economic performance occurred during this time. Types of gross domestic product. GDP can be reported in several ways, each of which provides slightly different information. Nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is an assessment of economic production in an economy that includes current prices in its calculation. In other words, it doesn't strip out inflation or the pace of rising prices, which can inflate the growth figure. All goods and services counted in nominal GDP are valued at the prices that those goods and services are actually sold for in that year. Nominal GDP is evaluated in either the local currency or US dollars at currency market exchange rates to compare countries' GDPs in purely financial terms. Nominal GDP is used when comparing different quarters of output within the same year. When comparing the GDP of two or more years, the real GDP is used. This is because, in effect, the removal of the influence of inflation allows the comparison of the different years to focus solely on volume. Real GDP. Real GDP is an inflation-adjusted measure that reflects the quantity of goods and services produced by an economy in a given year, with prices held constant from year to year to separate out the impact of inflation or deflation from the trend in output over time. Since GDP is based on the monetary value of goods and services, it is subject to inflation. Rising prices will tend to increase a country's GDP, but this does not necessarily reflect any change in the quality of goods and services produced. Thus, by looking just at an economy's nominal GDP, it can be difficult to tell whether the figure has risen because of a real expansion in production or simply because prices rose. Economists use a process that adjusts for inflation to arrive at an economy's real GDP. by adjusting the output in any given year for the price levels that prevailed in a reference year called the base year. Economists can adjust for inflation's impacts. This way, it is possible to compare a country's GDP from one year to another and see if there is any real growth. Real GDP is calculated using a GDP price deflator, which is the difference in prices between the current year and the base year. For example, if prices rose by 5% since the base year, then the deflator would be 1.05. Nominal GDP is divided by this deflator, yielding real GDP. Nominal GDP is usually higher than real GDP because inflation is typically a positive number. Real GDP accounts for changes in market value and thus narrows the difference between output figures from year to year. If there is a large discrepancy between a nation's real GDP and national GDP, this may be an indicator of significant inflation or deflation in its economy. GDP per capita. GDP per capita is a measurement of the GDP per person in a country's population. It indicates that the amount of output or income per person in an economy can indicate average productivity or average living standards. GDP per capita can be stated in nominal, real, inflation adjusted, or PPP, purchasing power parity terms. At a basic interpretation, per capita GDP shows how much economic production value can be attributed to each individual citizen. This also translates to a measure of overall national wealth, since GDP market value per person also readily serves as a prosperity measure. Per capita GDP is often analyzed alongside more traditional measures of GDP. Economists use this metric for insight into their own country's domestic productivity and the productivity of other countries. Per capita GDP considers both a country's GDP and its population. Therefore, it can be important to understand how each factor contributes to the overall result and is affecting per capita GDP growth. If a country's per capita GDP is growing with a stable population level, for example, it could be the result of technological progressions that are producing more with the same population level. Some countries may have a high per capita GDP but a small population, which usually means they have built up a self-sufficient economy based on an abundance of special resources. GDP growth rates. The GDP growth rate compares the year-over-year or quarterly change in a country's economic output to measure how fast an economy is growing. Usually expressed as a percentage rate, this measure is popular for economic policy makers because GDP growth is thought to be closely connected to key policy targets such as inflation and employment rates. If GDP growth rates accelerate, it might be a signal that the economy is overheating, and the central bank may seek to raise interest rates. Conversely, central banks see a shrinking or negative GDP growth rates, for example recession, as a signal that rates should be lowered and the stimulus may be necessary. GDP purchasing power parity, PPP. While not directly a measure of GDP, economists look at purchasing power parity, PPP, to see how one country's GDP measures up in international dollars. Using a method that adjusts for differences in local prices and costs of living to make cross-country comparisons of real output, real income, and living standards. How to calculate GDP? GDP can be determined via three primary methods. All three methods should yield the same figure when correctly calculated. These three approaches are often termed the expenditure approach, the output or production approach, and the income approach. The expenditure approach. The expenditure approach, also known as the spending approach, calculates spending by the different groups that participate in the economy. The US GDP is primarily measured based on the expenditure approach. This approach can be calculated using the following formula. GDP equals C plus G plus I plus NX, where C equals consumption, G equals government spending, I equals investment, and NX net exports. All of these activities contribute to the GDP of a country. Consumption refers to private consumption expenditures over consumer spending. Consumers spend money to acquire goods and services, such as groceries and haircuts. Consumer spending is the biggest component of GDP, accounting for more than 2/3 of the US GDP. Consumer confidence, therefore, has a very significant bearing on economic growth. A high confidence level indicates that consumers are willing to spend, while a low confidence level reflects uncertainty about the future and an unwillingness to spend. Government spending represents government consumption expenditure and gross investment. Governments spend money on equipment, infrastructure, and payroll. Government spending may become more important relative to other components of a country's GDP when consumer spending and business investment both decline sharply. This may occur in the wake of a recession, for example. Investment refers to private domestic investment or capital expenditures. Businesses spend money to invest in their business activities. For example, a business may buy machinery. Business investment is a critical component of GDP since it increases the productive capacity of an economy and boosts employment levels. The net exports formula subtracts total exports from total imports. NX equals exports minus imports. The goods and services that an economy makes that are exported to other countries, less the imports that are purchased by domestic consumers, represent a country's net exports. All expenditures by companies located in a given country, even if they are foreign companies, are included in this calculation.